In the quiet driveway of her own house, the slap echoed beneath the front steps that carried her name on the deed. Officer Cade Mercer never asked for identification, never checked the security camera mounted above the garage, and never paused long enough to hear an explanation. He looked at her skin, glanced at the sedan parked near the porch, and decided within seconds that she was a thief standing on property that could not possibly belong to her. Serena Hale did not fight back. She wiped a thin line of blood from the corner of her mouth and asked him in a voice far too calm for the moment whether he wanted to change his report before his supervisor arrived. A short time later, the police chief pulled up, said two words that identified her true title, and Cade Mercer folded to his knees beside his own patrol car. If you want to watch an arrogant man dig his own grave one bad decision at a time, tap subscribe on this channel and stay for every twist in this reversal. Serena Hale arrived at the brick house on Rosemont Heights in the late afternoon, guiding her dark sedan into a driveway she had not used in years. The street was lined with older colonial homes, many of them now surrounded by construction fences as a wave of luxury developments crept closer under the banner of Ashford Urban Holdings. She had just finalized the transfer of ownership from her late aunt's family trust into her own name, closing a chapter that had taken months of paperwork and quiet grief to complete. Serena planned to live in the house while she oversaw an investigation that would soon consume every waking hour of her days. Across the street, a neighbor named Mira Langley watched from behind a curtain as Serena opened the garage, carried in several sealed file boxes, and disappeared through the front door. Mira had never met the new owner and had grown used to thinking of the house as vacant, a leftover relic from an elderly woman who had died the previous winter. Rather than crossing the street to introduce herself, Mira picked up her phone and reported a suspicious woman breaking into a home that in her mind still belonged to someone else entirely. Serena noticed Mira recording from her window, but chose not to react since she had grown accustomed to suspicious glances in places where people assumed she did not belong or could not possibly afford to be standing. One of the boxes she carried inside bore an official state seal, the kind reserved for confidential appointments that had not yet been made public. Her phone buzzed with a short message confirming a formal announcement scheduled for the following morning, along with a note that the list of subjects under review had already been finalized and locked. The very first name on that list belonged to Cade Mercer, though nothing in the message explained who he was or why his name mattered so much. Serena set her phone on the kitchen counter, exhaled slowly, and allowed herself one quiet evening before the storm she knew was coming. She had spent years building a career on patience, on waiting for the right moment before revealing everything she knew, and tonight would be no exception. Her aunt Loretta Hale had practiced civil rights law in this very city for decades, taking cases that other attorneys refused to touch and winning several that reshaped how the department handled use of force complaints. Growing up, Serena had spent countless afternoons in that same kitchen listening to Loretta describe how power protected itself unless someone forced it to answer for its choices in daylight. She remembered her aunt's voice most clearly on the subject of patience. The way Loretta insisted that the loudest reaction rarely produced the strongest outcome in a courtroom or anywhere else. Moving into this house felt less like starting something new and more like continuing a conversation her aunt had never finished. What she did not yet know was that the storm would arrive far sooner than the following morning. Cade Mercer and his newer partner, Officer Elise Marin, received the call about a possible break-in while finishing an earlier patrol nearby. On the drive over, Elise suggested checking the property records first since she had learned early in her training that assumptions caused more trouble than they solved. Mercer waved off the idea, muttering that Rosemont Heights had grown sloppy ever since the city started letting people move in who, in his words, simply did not fit the neighborhood. The remark was vague enough that he could later deny any prejudice behind it, yet clear enough that Elise felt a small knot form in her stomach. When the patrol car stopped in front of the house, Serena was lifting a suitcase from her trunk, dressed casually in jeans and a plain jacket rather than anything that announced status or wealth. Mercer stepped out first and ordered her without preamble to place her hands on the hood of her own vehicle. Serena calmly explained that she was the homeowner and could produce documentation proving it within seconds if only he would give her the chance. Mercer ignored the explanation, refused to ask for her full name, never checked the license plate registered to the address, and would not allow her to reach for her phone. He repeatedly referred to her as girl, a term that felt deliberately diminishing, given that Serena was a grown woman and carried herself with the composure of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. When she corrected him and stated her name clearly, Cade Mercer laughed under his breath and told her that whoever lived at this address did not carry a name like Hale. He was relying on outdated information still sitting in the patrol system, unaware that the ownership transfer had been recorded only hours earlier that same day. Elise began to feel the situation slipping towards something dangerous. Noticing the house keys already in Serena's hand, boxes labeled with the same street address, and a smart lighting system she had just activated from her phone. Serena asked Mercer directly to turn on his body camera, and he claimed his unit was malfunctioning, apparently forgetting that Elise's camera continued recording every second of the encounter. The tension in the driveway thickened with each passing exchange. Though Serena's voice never rose above a level tone, Mercer studied the sedan, the size of the house, and the simplicity of Serena's clothing, then delivered a line that would later be replayed in front of an entire city council chamber. He told her that a person could not simply walk into a neighborhood like this and claim that everything around her belonged to her. Serena looked at him without flinching and answered that this was precisely what he was doing with the badge pinned to his own chest. The exchange left Elise visibly uncomfortable. Though she said nothing yet, still uncertain whether speaking up would cost her more than staying silent. Serena requested once more that Elise contact a supervisor, a request that Mercer apparently interpreted as a personal challenge to his authority. His grip tightened around her wrist as she reached down to set her suitcase on the pavement. And for the first time, real fear flickered behind Elise's eyes as she watched her training partner cross a line that could not easily be uncrossed. Mercer demanded to know why Serena refused to cooperate. Though she had done nothing except ask for basic procedure to be followed, he could not settle on a single accusation, shifting from suspected break-in to alleged vehicle theft, then finally landing on a vague charge of obstructing an officer performing his duties. Serena pointed out evenly and without raising her voice that the shifting accusations were being recorded and would eventually be reviewed by people far more thorough than he expected. The observation seemed to unravel whatever composure remained in him, and when she turned toward Elise to ask for confirmation that the recording was active, Cade Mercer struck her across the face. The sound cracked through the quiet street sharp enough that curtains twitched in at least two nearby windows, though the moment itself passed in an instant. Serena stumbled slightly, but did not fall. Steadying herself against the trunk of her own car while blood welled faintly at the corner of her lip, she looked directly at him, her expression unreadable, and asked whether he wanted to revise his account before his supervisor arrived to review the situation. Mercer dismissed the question, convinced she was bluffing with borrowed legal language picked up from television rather than real experience. He ordered Elise to place Serena in handcuffs immediately, expecting instant obedience from a partner he had trained to follow him without hesitation. Elise hesitated, then refused outright, stating clearly that no lawful basis for an arrest existed anywhere in what she had witnessed. Mercer turned his anger toward her instead, threatening that her career would end before it truly began if she continued questioning him in front of a civilian. Meanwhile, unseen by either officer, a doorbell camera above the front entrance had already captured the entire confrontation in crisp detail, automatically uploading a backup copy to an external server the moment the file closed. A neighbor 2 houses down stood frozen at his kitchen window, watching the same slap that Mira's earlier phone call had unknowingly set into motion. Mercer's own radio transmission to dispatch, describing a combative suspect resisting identification, was recorded in full and timestamped for later review. Serena chose not to reveal her position or title in that moment, curious to see exactly how far a man convinced of his own authority would continue pushing against someone he believed had no power at all. She understood something Mercer did not yet grasp, which was that every word he spoke, every accusation he invented was quietly becoming evidence rather than justification. The street remained still except for the low hum of the patrol car engine and Mercer's ragged breathing as adrenaline finally began to catch up with his temper. What none of them anticipated was how quickly the balance of power in that driveway was about to shift entirely. Because Elise had quietly requested backup on a separate channel, Police Chief Brennan Crowe arrived at the scene in person, having been only minutes away en route to a fundraising dinner nearby. He stepped out of his vehicle, already sensing that something had gone badly wrong, and the instant he recognized the woman standing in the driveway, the color drained visibly from his face. Crowe addressed her immediately, using a title that meant nothing to Mercer, but landed like a thunderclap across the quiet street. He called her Special Prosecutor Hale, the newly appointed independent investigator handpicked by the governor's office to examine civil rights violations within the Ashford Police Department. Mercer still did not understand, having assumed until that exact moment that Serena was simply a low-level city attorney with an inflated sense of self-importance. Crowe was forced to explain plainly in front of everyone present that Serena Hale had been assigned to investigate falsified reports, unlawful use of force, and a pattern of civil rights abuses spanning years within his own department. The formal announcement scheduled for the following morning would confirm publicly what Crowe had just revealed in a stranger's driveway. Cade Mercer, it turned out, sat near the very top of the list of officers scheduled for immediate questioning once the investigation became official. Serena calmly opened the suitcase that had triggered the entire confrontation, revealing not stolen property, but carefully organized case files, each one bearing his name across incident reports involving stops, detentions, and pressure campaigns against black homeowners throughout Rosemont Heights. Mercer finally understood that the woman he had struck moments earlier was not merely someone with authority over him, but someone who had already known his name before she ever stepped out of her car that afternoon. His legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he stumbled backward, catching himself against the patrol car before sinking down beside its front tire, gasping for air. The confidence that had defined him only minutes earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow realization that every choice he made in that driveway had been recorded, witnessed, and now permanently attached to his name. Serena did not mock him or raise her voice in triumph, choosing instead to issue a series of calm, precise instructions to the chief standing beside her. She told Crow to formally remove Mercer's badge and weapon according to proper procedure, to preserve every camera file connected to the incident without alteration, to document Elise as a material witness, and to ensure that no one touched the official report before an independent reviewer examined it. Crow, visibly desperate to avoid embarrassment before the next morning's announcement, quietly asked whether the matter could be resolved privately between departments. Serena answered that the very impulse to resolve such matters privately was exactly what had allowed men like Mercer to remain on the force for as long as they had. The first reversal of the story was complete, yet Serena understood clearly that a single slap in a driveway was only the visible edge of something far larger and far more organized beneath the surface. She drove away that night already anticipating the resistance that would surely follow once powerful people realized what she had begun to uncover. By the time darkness fully settled over Ashford, the police union had already begun mounting its counterattack. Corbin Hale, the union's sharp and media-savvy president, arrived at the station and met privately with both Mercer and Crow before any official statement could be issued. He instructed everyone present to align their accounts, insisting that Serena had behaved aggressively, refused to identify herself, and appeared to reach for an unknown object inside her suitcase during the encounter. A preliminary report was quietly rewritten to describe Mercer as having used open-hand control techniques rather than acknowledging that he had struck her across the face. Mercer's own body camera conveniently was declared permanently malfunctioning, while Elise's footage was temporarily flagged as a synchronization error and removed from the internal system entirely. By sunrise, a heavily edited clip had already leaked to local media outlets, framing Serena as a powerful official who had deliberately provoked a hardworking officer performing his duties. Hale organized a press conference within hours describing Mercer as a dedicated public servant, unfairly targeted by an official abusing her new position for personal reasons. Serena immediately faced pressure to withdraw from any direct role in the case, since continuing to personally investigate the man who had struck her would give critics an easy argument to dismiss every finding as biased retaliation. She understood the danger clearly and made a decisive move before anyone could accuse her of overreach. Serena transferred the assault investigation entirely to the state's independent inspector general, established a legal team that reported to no one under her direct supervision, and continued only the broader investigation into the department's long-standing pattern of civil rights violations. The decision instantly dismantled Hale's central argument, since it removed any appearance that Serena was pursuing personal revenge rather than institutional accountability. Hale, however, believed the footage capturing the slap had already been permanently erased, unaware that Elise's camera had automatically backed up to a separate state server as part of a pilot program she had joined months earlier without mentioning it to anyone at the department. An intact copy of the recording still existed, untouched and unedited. Though Serena chose not to release it immediately, she wanted first to trace exactly who had ordered the internal footage deleted. Suspecting the decision had come from somewhere higher than a single defensive officer trying to protect his own record, her investigative team began quietly reviewing years of prior complaints filed against Mercer, most of which had been closed without any meaningful follow-up or interview of the original complainants. A troubling pattern slowly emerged from the paperwork, one that extended far beyond a single officer's personal prejudice into something resembling a coordinated strategy. Mercer consistently patrolled areas outside his officially assigned district, and each of those areas happened to overlap precisely with properties that Ashford Urban Holdings had targeted for future development. Homeowners in those areas were repeatedly cited for minor violations, stopped without clear cause, or accused of disturbances that rarely held up to scrutiny. Serena's team cross-referenced years of citation records against public filings from Ashford Urban Holdings and its various subsidiaries, building a timeline that no single department had ever bothered to assemble before. A young analyst on her staff discovered that 7 separate shell companies, each registered under different names, ultimately traced back to the same law firm that handled Ashford's real estate acquisitions. Every one of those shell companies had purchased at least one property within Rosemont Heights during the months following an unusually aggressive round of citations issued nearly to the family living there. The pattern held with striking consistency. repeating itself street after street in a way that could not reasonably be dismissed as coincidence. After months of mounting pressure, many of those same families eventually sold their homes well below market value, and within weeks, entities connected to Ashford Urban Holdings acquired the properties through intermediary companies. Serena began to suspect that Mira Langley's original call reporting a suspicious woman in the driveway might not have been entirely coincidental. After all, Mira belonged to a neighborhood association that received quiet funding from an Ashford-affiliated foundation, ostensibly to protect property values, but functionally serving as an early warning system for unfamiliar faces on the block. Cade Mercer, Serena realized, was not simply a man carrying private prejudice into his uniform each morning. He had become a tool in a much larger campaign to pressure minority homeowners out of a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, one incident report at a time. The realization reframed everything that had happened in her own driveway as something far more calculated than a single officer's momentary lapse in judgment. Elise agreed to meet Serena privately at a neutral location away from the station, admitting under quiet questioning that Crow had long instructed officers to minimize documentation whenever Mercer used physical force during an encounter. She confessed to being afraid of losing her position and being ostracized by colleagues who had known Mercer for years and treated him as something close to untouchable. Serena did not pressure her to become a hero, understanding that courage rarely arrives as a single dramatic gesture and more often as a quiet, difficult choice made in private. She simply asked Elise what kind of officer she wanted to see reflected back at her a decade from now, when she looked in the mirror each morning before her shift. Elise eventually handed over a backup copy of the full recording, a series of text messages in which Mercer instructed her to alter her written report, an audio clip of Hale coaching him on how to describe the confrontation, and a private list detailing every occasion Mercer had disabled his camera before approaching black residents. Serena realized she was no longer investigating a single act of violence, but documented proof of an organized effort to conceal a pattern of abuse spanning years. Near the end of that same week, a member of Serena's small team reported something alarming: an unauthorized attempt to access sealed investigative files and download a complete list of confirmed witnesses. The threat had shifted from a smear campaign aimed at her reputation into something closer to direct interference with the investigation itself. Serena understood immediately that whoever ordered the intrusion had far more resources than a single police union could command on its own. She began tracing the digital footprint of the breach, expecting it to lead somewhere beyond the walls of the police department entirely. The pattern of targeted properties, coordinated pressure, and now digital intrusion pointed towards someone with both enormous financial motive and the means to protect it. That someone, she soon confirmed, was Maxwell Ashford himself, the billionaire founder whose company had quietly shaped much of the pressure campaign from behind the scenes. Maxwell Ashford invited Serena to the top floor of his corporate headquarters, a glass office overlooking nearly the entire skyline of Ashford. He greeted her with practiced warmth, offering coffee and speaking at length about the city's future growth before addressing the actual purpose of the meeting. Ashford explained in a tone that never once raised in volume that Ashford needed development and that a handful of overly sensitive residents were standing in the way of genuine progress. Hodge implied, without ever stating it outright, a series of generous arrangements designed to make her investigation quietly disappear. These included funding a police reform foundation that would bear her name, supporting a future run for higher public office, and purchasing her family home for triple its current market value. Ashford seemed to believe, with the calm certainty of a man who had never been told no, that every person eventually had a price worth naming. Serena asked him plainly why a real estate billionaire would take such a personal interest in the fate of an ordinary patrol officer. The question landed harder than he expected, and for a brief moment, his composed expression slipped just enough to reveal something closer to genuine unease. She placed a printed map on the table between them, showing every property that had been pressured into a forced sale, the parcels forming a single unbroken corridor perfectly aligned with a multi-billion-dollar commercial project already in planning. Ashford's tone shifted from persuasion to condescension, suggesting that Serena was letting personal emotion cloud her judgment after being struck, and that she lacked the experience to understand how a real city actually operated. Serena replied that he had just made the same mistake Mercer made in her driveway, assuming that a black woman standing across from him could be measured, categorized, and dismissed before she ever finished speaking. The comparison visibly unsettled him, though he quickly attempted to mask it behind another practiced smile. He rose from his chair and walked toward the wide window overlooking the skyline. Speaking now in the tone of a man accustomed to explaining the world to people he considered less experienced than himself, Ashford described his father's construction company, the decades he had spent transforming forgotten blocks into thriving commercial corridors, and the tax revenue his projects generated for a city that in his telling would collapse without men willing to take bold risks. He suggested that Serena's investigation, however well-intentioned, threatened to undo years of careful progress over what he called an unfortunate but ultimately minor personnel matter. Serena let him finish completely before responding, understanding that his need to justify himself at length revealed more than any of his prepared offers ever could. She reminded him quietly that progress built on coercion was simply theft, wearing a nicer suit, and that the families forced from their homes would not remember his tax revenue when they remembered losing everything they owned. What Ashford did not fully consider was that his own attorney had insisted the meeting be recorded for mutual protection, and Serena had agreed without hesitation from the very start. Every implied bribe, every veiled threat, and every dismissive remark had now been captured on a legally admissible recording. As she left the building, Ashford immediately placed a call to Hale, instructing him to destroy her credibility before the upcoming public hearing could take place. Neither man yet understood that the conversation meant to intimidate her had instead handed Serena one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case. She drove home that evening past construction, cranes rising over half-emptied blocks, understanding with total clarity the scale of what she was actually up against. The battle ahead would not be fought only in a driveway or a precinct office, but in boardrooms, hearing chambers, and the quiet machinery of a city built to protect its wealthiest residents. Hale launched an aggressive media campaign designed to portray Serena as dishonest and unreliable in the eyes of the public. A deceptively edited clip surfaced online, showing only the argument between Serena and Mercer while conveniently cutting away before the slap itself occurred. Sympathetic commentators questioned why a special prosecutor would fail to immediately disclose her title, framing her silence as evidence of manipulation rather than simple restraint under pressure. Mira Langley appeared on a local broadcast describing Serena as threatening and claiming the neighborhood had felt far safer before her arrival on the street. Mercer himself sat for an interview, appearing exhausted and sympathetic, insisting he had simply been performing his duty without any awareness of who she truly was. He let slip a single unguarded sentence that would later haunt him far more than anything Hale had scripted for him. He said that if she had only told him who she was from the beginning, none of it would have happened at all. The statement quietly revealed the belief underlying his entire worldview that ordinary people could be treated however he wished, while only those with recognized power deserved basic decency and respect. Serena did not respond immediately, allowing the public to sit with his words while Hale grew increasingly confident that his campaign was succeeding exactly as planned. At a formal hearing before the city council, Hale presented the altered internal report as though it were complete and unquestionable. Ha insisted no full recording of the incident existed and accused Serena of exploiting her authority to destroy the career of a hardworking officer. Serena responded with a series of short, precise questions rather than a lengthy rebuttal, each one landing like a small, deliberate blow against his prepared narrative. She asked who had first accessed Elise's camera footage after the incident occurred. She asked who had changed the official language from an open-hand strike to a control technique. She asked why the internal recording had been deleted a short time after Chief Crow left the scene that afternoon. She asked how Hale had come to know the specific contents of a file that had not yet been made public to anyone outside her team. Hale's confident expression began to falter under the weight of questions he clearly had not prepared to answer. Serena gave a single signal, and the untouched recording from Elise's camera played in full across the large screen mounted above the council chamber. The entire room heard Mercer belittle Serena, shift his accusations repeatedly, threaten Elise's career, and finally strike a woman standing peacefully in her own driveway. There was no remaining space left for spin, denial, or clever reinterpretation of what had actually taken place that afternoon. Even Hale, normally composed under pressure, sat in visible silence as the recording finished and the chamber remained utterly still. Serena did not gloat or raise her voice, allowing the weight of the footage to speak entirely for itself. She understood that the true battle had never been about proving what happened in that driveway, but about exposing the machinery built to hide it afterward. That machinery had just been dragged piece by piece into full public view. Even after the recording played, Hale attempted one final defense, describing the incident as an unfortunate mistake made during a single moment of heightened tension. Serena refused to engage with questions of emotion or momentary lapse, choosing instead to shift the hearing entirely toward documented systemic evidence. She methodically presented one file after another before the stunned council members and gathered press. The first showed that prior complaints against Mercer had been closed without ever interviewing a single witness involved. The second revealed indirect payments flowing from an Ashford-affiliated consulting firm into a support fund controlled by the police union. The third displayed a detailed map identifying every family pressured by Mercer shortly before selling their property below market value. The fourth was a message from Crow instructing subordinates to reduce the severity of language used in official incident reports involving force. The fifth was the recorded audio of Hale personally coaching Mercer on how to reshape his account of the assault. The sixth was the recording from Ashford's own office, capturing his attempt to offer personal benefits in exchange for narrowing the scope of her investigation. Watching remotely from his headquarters, Ashford realized with sudden clarity that Serena had never entered his office intending to negotiate anything at all. She had simply given him enough space to condemn himself in his own words. Fully aware that his attorney's insistence on recording the meeting would ultimately become the very evidence that destroyed him, Crow attempted to shift full responsibility onto Mercer and Hale, but Serena produced internal emails proving he had known about the underlying pattern of complaints for years. Elise walked into the hearing chamber wearing her full uniform, having chosen to appear despite significant pressure from colleagues urging her to stay silent. She publicly confirmed the authenticity of the recording and described in steady detail how she had been repeatedly instructed to soften her written account of what she witnessed. Mercer watched from across the room as every person who had once shielded him gradually fell silent one by one, unwilling to risk their own position to protect his. He understood then that he had never truly been protected at all, only positioned as the first and most visible casualty in a much larger unraveling. Serena did not ask the room to celebrate or applaud what had just occurred, choosing instead to close her presentation with a single measured statement. She said that the slap itself had lasted only a single second. Yet, the system built to protect the man who delivered it had been operating quietly for many years before that moment ever arrived. In the weeks that followed, both the State Inspector General's office and federal investigators executed coordinated search actions across several locations tied to the case. Agents entered the headquarters of the police union, the executive offices of Ashford Urban Holdings, the records division of the Ashford Police Department, and a small intermediary firm responsible for funneling payments to Mercer and several other officers. No dramatic confrontations or physical struggles accompanied these actions, since the true weight of the moment came instead from evidence boxes carried past reporters and powerful figures forced to walk silently through crowded hallways under public scrutiny. Mercer was formally terminated from the department, stripped of his professional certification, and charged with assault, falsification of official records, and obstruction of an active investigation. Hale faced separate charges connected to destruction of evidence and improper interference with a material witness. During an ongoing inquiry, Crow resigned from his position before the city council could formally vote to remove him, though his resignation did nothing to shield him from the criminal investigation that followed shortly after. Ashford was charged in connection with bribery, fraudulent land acquisition, and conspiracy to violate the civil rights of numerous homeowners across the affected neighborhood. His own board of directors moved swiftly to suspend him from leadership, hoping to preserve what remained of the company's public reputation and market value. Mira Langley admitted that her neighborhood association had accepted payments in exchange for repeatedly reporting homeowners who refused to accept offers to sell their properties. She was never portrayed as a central villain in the unfolding story, yet she faced meaningful social and legal consequences for the choices she had made along the way. In an unexpected turn, Mercer offered to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, surrendering a series of messages that directly tied both Ashford and Hale to decisions about which specific families should face the greatest pressure. The man who once believed the system existed solely to protect him ultimately became a witness, and testifying against the very structure that had shielded him for years. Serena permitted the independent prosecutor's office to evaluate his cooperation fairly, but she made no promises that his assistance would spare him from the consequences of his own choices. She understood that justice properly applied could not depend on selective mercy extended only to those willing to trade information for leniency. Her focus remained fixed instead on ensuring that every level of the conspiracy, not merely its most visible face, faced full accountability under the law. The investigation that began with a single slap in a quiet driveway had within months reshaped the leadership of an entire city. Sometime later, the courts began announcing plea agreements and initial sentencing decisions connected to the case. Cade Mercer pleaded guilty to the charges against him, though during his sentencing hearing, he attempted to argue that his entire career had been destroyed over what he described as a single lapse in judgment. Serena was permitted to address the court as the victim of the assault, yet she chose not to request the harshest possible sentence available under the law. Instead, she reminded the courtroom clearly that the true issue had never been limited to the moment his hand struck her face. Mercer had been given numerous opportunities to stop everything before it escalated any further than it needed to. He could have stopped when Serena first stated plainly that she was the rightful homeowner standing on her own property. He could have stopped when Elise asked him to simply verify basic identification before proceeding further. He could have stopped while the cameras around them continued recording every word and gesture exchanged. He could have stopped when Chief Crow arrived and the full truth of the situation became unmistakably clear. He could have stopped while writing his own official report describing what had taken place that afternoon. He could have stopped when the union instructed him to lie and instead chose obedience over honesty each single time. Serena addressed him directly, her voice steady and free of anger, stating that he had not lost his career simply because he failed to recognize who she was that afternoon. She told him plainly that he lost everything because he believed a person needed to hold significant status before deserving basic human decency and respect. The presiding judge echoed a similar sentiment in the formal ruling, emphasizing that Serena's professional title did not make his conduct more serious under the law, but merely ensured that conduct otherwise hidden from view could no longer remain concealed. Elise was permitted to remain on the police force, later transferring into a newly restructured division focused on professional standards and internal accountability. She was never framed within the story as someone who single-handedly rescued Serena, but rather as a person who, when finally given the choice, decided to fulfill the responsibility her position had always required of her. Serena completed her full investigative report in the months that followed, proposing a series of concrete reforms intended to prevent similar patterns from repeating themselves within the department. She called for an independent storage system for camera footage that no internal office could quietly access or alter without oversight. She recommended formal policies prohibiting any police union representative from participating in the editing of official incident reports. She proposed an automatic referral process whenever an officer accumulated multiple similar complaints within a defined period of time. She insisted on fair compensation for every homeowner who had been pressured into selling their property under duress connected to the broader scheme. She also called for the creation of an independent civilian oversight board granted genuine authority to formally request and review internal department records. Facing continued pressure from state oversight and mounting public attention, the city ultimately adopted the majority of her proposed reforms under direct judicial supervision. 1 year later, Serena still lived in the brick house on Rosemont Heights, unwilling to sell it to any developer despite repeated offers that continued arriving through various intermediaries. She had not transformed the home into some grand symbol of triumph, choosing instead to quietly restore her late aunt's old study exactly as it had once been. On one wall, she hung a small wooden sign that had originally belonged to her aunt's private law office many years earlier. The words engraved across it read simply that no person should ever be required to prove their own importance before receiving fair and equal treatment. The stretch of land Ashford had once intended to seize for his commercial project was instead converted into a permanent housing preservation fund overseen independently of city government. Several of the families who had been pressured into selling their homes years earlier received meaningful compensation, while others were granted the formal right to reclaim their original properties. One elderly couple who had left Rosemont Heights under duress years earlier returned to the same corner house they had built their lives around, standing quietly on the porch as movers carried their furniture back through the front door. A young widow whose husband had died shortly after their forced sale used her settlement to open a small bakery 2 blocks from where their original home once stood. Serena attended none of these moments as a public figure seeking recognition, preferring instead to read about them later in brief updates from her legal team. She had never wanted her name attached to the recovery of what these families had lost, believing that true accountability required no audience and no applause to hold its meaning. On a quiet morning, Serena stepped out into the same driveway where Cade Mercer had once ordered her to place her hands against her own vehicle before striking her across the face. A patrol car rolled slowly past the house driven by a young officer she did not recognize from earlier in the case. He glanced toward her, offered a simple nod of acknowledgement, and continued driving without stopping, without demanding identification, and without assuming she represented any kind of threat to the neighborhood around her. Serena did not consider the moment a complete or final victory, understanding clearly that no institution changes entirely simply because a single individual finally faces consequences for his actions. Yet, for the first time in a long while, the people operating within that system understood something they had previously taken for granted. That recorded footage might not simply disappear, that written reports could face genuine scrutiny, and that a person they once dismissed without a second thought might ultimately hold the authority to demand real accountability under the law. She looked toward the small plaque beside her front entrance, where only 2 words remained visible to anyone passing by on the street. It read simply, Serena Hale, without any accompanying title, position, or explanation attached beneath it. She had never needed to announce who she was in order to prove that the house and everything surrounding it truly belonged to her. And in the end, Cade Mercer had never needed to know her name at all in order to treat her from the very first moment as a human being deserving of basic dignity and respect.